Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and today we're going to focus on India-China-Pakistan relations, but specifically on the India-China relationship. Many of you have been following the dramatic events that have been unfolding between India and Pakistan over the past several weeks, and the brief skirmish that happens, a ceasefire does appear to be holding, although there are reports of minor infractions along the way. But as we are recording today's show, Pakistani Prime Minister Sushant Singh is spending the week in Beijing meeting with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi. They are expected to talk about closer cooperation, and Wang Yi will also probably deliver a very robust endorsement of the China-Pakistan relationship, what they call all-weather friends and all-weather partners. This is only going to fuel speculation in India that they are now increasingly fighting a two-front campaign, one against Pakistan and the other against China. And this comes after a year, if you recall, of real warming and détente between India and China and pulling back of troops along the line of actual control, the reestablishment of ambassadors in both countries, the reestablishment of direct flights, more students going back and forth. That all seems to be potentially in question, and that's what we're going to find out today. So I'm thrilled to have on the show again with us to help explain everything that's going on from an Indian perspective, Sushant Singh, who is a lecturer at Yale University in the United States, but today joins us from New Delhi. Great to have you back on the show, Sushant.
Thank you, Eric. As always, it's a pleasure to be on your show.
It's really wonderful to have you, and I'm really hoping you're going to help kind of us navigate through this very complex maze of different issues that are out there. What I'm going to do is break our discussion into three different topics because you can't kind of mash it all up together. But I first want to talk about, just to get your overview of where you think we are right now in the aftermath of Operation Sindoor, which was the conflict between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. The key question that a lot of people are talking about is the performance of Chinese weapons in this conflict. A lot of people in India say the Chinese J-10 fighters and the PL-15 air-to-air missiles were overrated. The stock price of these weapons manufacturers in China went shooting up. In Pakistan, there's a lot of excitement over the fact that they're using a Chinese military ecosystem. Give us a little bit of the take that you're seeing in New Delhi about where we are right now vis-a-vis the China-India-Pakistan.
Oh, definitely. So firstly, Eric, the India-Pakistan fighting stopped last week, and clearly there's a ceasefire, which you correctly said is holding as of now. Although, there has been no reset of the escalation ladder, and people like me are really worried that if the next conflict happens, it would happen at a much higher intensity, at a much higher level, with much lesser chances of a diplomatic intervention by a foreign power like Pakistan. That's in a nutshell is where the conflict between India and Pakistan currently stays. But to my mind, the big winner out of these events of the last couple of weeks has been China. One is, of course, the fact that you brought out that the Chinese weaponry, the Chinese systems, and more important than the weaponry per se, whether it is the fighter jets or the missiles, is the way they were employed because of the way the Pakistani Air Force had done joint training with the PLA Air Force. I think in one of your pieces you alluded to this idea, because they are operating in a different philosophy, using different AI tools, using different Chinese satellite imagery, Chinese GPS, creating a network-centric warfare and using that network-centric warfare to fight a completely different kind of battle to what the Indian Air Force was fighting with its multi-vendor architecture. So, Indian Air Force has stuff from France, from Russia, from the United States, from Israel, and to bring it all together and merge it in a seamless system is a very difficult proposition. Pakistan, in contrast, in last 5 years, 81% of its military equipment has come from China, and it has been doing a lot of joint training with China. So it is just not that that the Chinese J-10 fighter jet is better than Rafale or F-16. That's not the question here. The question is what is the operating philosophy under which Pakistani Air Force was operating, and how did they learn that operating philosophy, and how it surprised India and a lot of Western observers, and that has much larger consequences for Taiwan and for other areas. Let me just add one more thing. Because China has not really fought a war with its weapons or with its operating philosophy, a kind of a conventional war, really real conventional war. This is the first time that we saw two professional armies. These are both these militaries would figure in top 5, top 6, top 10 of the global militaries, really fighting with different kind of platforms, with different kind of weaponry, and using different kind of operating philosophy. And on one occasion, at least, the Chinese platform, the Chinese operating philosophy did very well. So this is the first time that it has happened. Of course, the Western observers and Indians will try and learn from what they've gotten wrong and how they were surprised. And I'm sure the Chinese and the Pakistanis will also learn as to what they can do better, so that they can still spring a surprise next time around. That is
Yes,
where it stays militarily as of now.
Yeah, to be fair, what the views that you've expressed, I generally agree with, but those are rather unpopular views in India, where they discount the performance of Chinese weapons and they say that it's been overblown and it's been exaggerated. We're starting to learn more, as you pointed out, about the extent of involvement between the Chinese and the Pakistanis. Let's take a listen to some analysis on Bloomberg, and then I'd like to get your reaction, Sushant.
Indian Defense Ministry-led research group alleges that China provided air defense and satellite support to Pakistan during its recent clash with India. It suggests Beijing was more directly involved in the conflict than previously disclosed. For more on what this means for ties, just as India and China were beginning to mend relations after several years, we're joined by government reporter Sudhi Ranjan Sen. Sudhi, how exactly did China help Pakistan during that conflict?
Well, from what we're getting to hear from the government right now is that China helped Pakistan reorganize its air defense, and at a very critical time. And this is just after 26 tourists in Kashmir are killed, and there is a clear statement that is coming, or an statement of intent coming from Prime Minister and Government of India, that there is going to be retaliation. So it clearly shows a direct involvement of China, which we did not know.
So this is echoing what you've said, which is this cohesive, integrated architecture, information architecture, gave the Pakistanis much more battlefield visibility than the Indians had, because the Beidou satellite systems were working with the ground radar systems, were working with the J-10Cs. And I guess that's what Bloomberg is reporting, and what the Indian government is starting to acknowledge now is this cohesive ecosystem, this single ecosystem. The way that I like to compare it is an Apple versus an Android. Apple, everything is made by Apple. The hardware, the software, the chips, you name it. And so information just flows much more seamlessly. Android, you've got a piecemeal system, much like, as you pointed out, the Indian military with Rafales made in France, and S-400 systems made by the Russians, and then obviously now American equipment coming into it, and lots of homegrown Indian technology, making it much more difficult to communicate. What Bloomberg is telling us, though, is that this integration is happening right now between China and Pakistan.
No, absolutely right. The reporter whom we just heard, Sudhi Ranjan Sen, is an old friend and colleague of mine. He's a very serious reporter, and when he says something, one has to take that seriously. The statement that the Bloomberg report refers to comes from a Defense Ministry think tank, which is affiliated with the Defense Ministry, and they have spoken about it. Eric, I think one thing which we should recognize amidst all this is that the Indian political leadership and the diplomatic leadership has been very careful in not using the word China. What maximum stuff that we have heard coming from the Indian side has come from the military leadership or military think tanks or military reporters or people who are seen to be speaking for the military, even if they're not directly the military leadership. So even if you look at the other two countries which really came out and strongly supported Pakistan, Azerbaijan and Turkey, a lot of India's political leaders, constitutional leaders have gone in a big way after Turkey and Azerbaijan. but no Indian political leader or diplomatic leader has uttered a word against China. So I clearly see a difference here. The political leadership is being very, very cautious in not naming China, even though they may know what the facts are, but they don't want to bring China in, provoke China, and destroy the kind of, a détente that was established last year, some kind of normalcy that was coming in with the relationship. I think there is also a recognition that they would not want to actually activate a two-front collusive threat where China and Pakistan both are militarily active at the same time, because that would really, really put India under a lot of pressure. On the military side, I think, and nobody has told me this, but my own analysis suggests that the Indian military is particularly saying this stuff because Pakistan by itself can do little. Pakistan by itself is economically weak, politically fragile. It's dependent on loans from IMF worth $1.4 billion, which it is like really living from one tranche of loan from IMF to another tranche of loan. It really can't afford to spend money to buy military equipment. If the Indian military leadership has to justify its modernization, it has to actually say that the Chinese are going to provide more and more stuff to Pakistan. That is the only way it can justify that much more, resources need to be devoted for buying more modern equipment for the Indian armed forces. Over the last 10 years since Mr. Modi became Prime Minister, the kind of resources that were going towards the military have plateaued or have come down in real terms as a percentage of GDP or in terms of US dollars, or the kind of money that has gone towards modernization. I think by raising the issue of China, the military can show that Pakistan can actually augment its capabilities, can become a much bigger power, much more powerful power, even though it may not have resources on its own. So that's why I see this divergence, almost two tracks on which there's silence from the political and the diplomatic side, while there is some noises coming from the military side, though not officially, but in quasi-official or in demi-official manner.
Okay, so just so I understand here, so we're seeing a lot of talk about China in the Indian kind of discourse right now, social media and the mainstream media. But again, notably, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, has not spoken out on this. We have heard from External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, but not on the Pakistan-China war. We're going to hear from him on another issue that popped up in terms of the renaming of disputed territories, and the External Affairs Minister was very outspoken there, but not on the Pakistan-India conflict. That's what you're saying. We have to be very careful what we hear and not to misinterpret what is, basically noise in the media as official positions coming from the government in New Delhi. Is that right?
Absolutely, Eric. When Jaishankar spoke to some select journalists, and he perhaps either on background or off the record mentioned a bit about Chinese satellites helping Pakistani military. And the moment it was reported in the media, whether erroneously or whether they refused, or he had not told them that was not to be reported, the External Affairs Ministry immediately came out and said, no, Jaishankar is being misquoted. He never mentioned that the Chinese satellites helped Pakistani military during this conflict. And immediately the Indian media networks took off that statement. So very clearly, that was a signal that the Indian political leadership is being very cautious, is being very careful in not mentioning the China-Pakistan nexus at all. As I said it earlier, Eric, if you're going to target Turkey and Azerbaijan, they barely provide, a very small fraction of the kind of help that China provides. The kind of help that China provides, everyone knows. It's not hidden, it's public. The kind of training exercises that they do, the kind of equipment that they get from China, the kind of diplomatic support that they get from China, the kind of support they get in the UN Security Council from China is publicly known to everyone. But the Indian political leadership is being very, very cautious in not provoking China or not drawing China in publicly, at least.
Help me understand something, because early on in this conflict, China did come out and try to be somewhat impartial. Everybody knew that they have this very strong relationship with Pakistan. But early on, and again, I'm going to go back to the specific date, which we're looking at May 11th, when Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi held phone calls with Ishaq Dar, the Pakistani foreign minister. Interestingly enough, the Indians did not make S. Jaishankar available to Wang Yi, and instead the Chinese foreign minister spoke with the Indian National Security Advisor Ajit Doval. Again, in protocol, that is not always normal. Normally, you want to speak kind of peer to peer, particularly in a moment of crisis like this. Should we interpret that as India being reluctant to allow China the space to become an arbiter or some type of kind of mediator for this conflict, given the lack of trust between New Delhi and Beijing?
So, Eric, 2 points here. Number one, 11th of May is when the ceasefire had already been announced. Ceasefire had been announced on 10th of May in the afternoon. And these calls essentially were made to say, no, we would want peace between both sides. So, as you say, a very even-handed kind of discourse. This was not the discourse coming out of Beijing when the conflict was on or when the tensions were building. This is post-ceasefire narrative.
Right.
Secondly, Wang Yi holds another position in respect to the India-China relationship. And that position is of the special representative of Xi Jinping. And Ajit Doval, India's national security advisor, also holds the position of special representative.
So it was peer-to-peer in
It
that
is a
respect.
peer-to-peer. So, and these are special representatives on boundary issues who are supposed to talk to each other. So whenever there was a problem, it's Wang Yi who speaks as the special representative to Doval as a special representative. They are their leaders, special representatives dedicated to talking to other countries. So Wang Yi has many positions. One of them is the foreign minister, in which he's equivalent of this thing. The special representative actually is a much higher position in that sense because it is the leader's personal special representative towards another country. So there was no kind of a signaling value out here at all.
Okay.
In fact, it was actually upgrading the conversation to special representatives rather than merely limiting it to foreign ministers.
And do we know if Jaishankar and Wang Yi have had any conversations at that level as foreign minister to foreign minister?
Nothing so far. In fact, Eric, we must also recognize that Jaishankar has been under a lot of pressure during and after the conflict because India did not do as well diplomatically as it expected to do. So if you realize there are only two countries who came out and supported India, Israel and Taliban, the Afghan Taliban. And it's a pretty horrible scenario. Neither France nor Russia, and nor any BRICS countries, nor your Quad partners, nor the United States, not even one country came out and mentioned the word terror or came out in India's support. And Jaishankar clearly, what I hear in Delhi and what I see in Delhi, seems to be under tremendous pressure. That all the narrative that India had built about becoming this next great power and really having friends everywhere has really not come to fruition when it really counted. So I can understand why Jaishankar is not fronting this because that would bring a lot of unwarranted political attention on what has diplomatically gone on. So there is a lot of domestic politics at play here as well because Mr. Modi himself has come under tremendous pressure after what President Trump has done. Because it has almost made Mr. Modi look very weak and fragile that he succumbed to the pressure put by President Trump and accepted the ceasefire. So there's a lot of domestic politics and domestic signaling and domestic PR going on around these global issues and diplomatic issues that you mentioned.
There was a lot of smugness in the U.S. discourse on this conflict, particularly related to China, to say China sees itself as the burgeoning hegemon in Asia, but yet when it came time to mediate this dispute, where did the players go? They went to Washington. Now, again, a lot of disagreements in India about the role that the United States played. Let's not forget that J.D. Vance, the vice president, initially was very dismissive of the conflict and said, let them kind of sort it out. Donald Trump himself said that this is a conflict that has been going on for thousands of years, which of course is ridiculous because Pakistan, I think, was formed in 1947. This is not even 100 years old, this conflict. And yet also India does not have a history of seeking outside mediation for any of its conflicts. And so for the United States to take credit for this really rubbed a lot of people in India the wrong way. That being said, a lot of it was directed towards China, who again sees itself as this regional hegemon and wants Asia for Asians, is something that they've said for a long time. And now when we had a major dispute, China becomes a partisan and is not seen as a mediator or did anything to really bring the conflict to a resolution. How do you see this, the mediation aspect of this? What happened in terms of, did India go seeking the mediation as the Pakistanis claim because the Pakistani military is performing so well? What was the United States' role in all of this? And could China ever be seen as a diplomatic arbiter in future conflicts involving India?
So as far as the United States is concerned, I think India and Pakistan both wanted to de-escalate. The door was already open and the Americans entered the door. They really, it is not that they were the ones, the Indians and Pakistan wanted to continue fighting, wanted to escalate. I think they had both made their points. They knew that any further escalation will lead to a much bigger crisis. And the way in which the United States intervened, or at least portrayed its intervention, really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way in India. It negated India's policy on Kashmir. It negated India's long-standing position position on not hyphenating India and Pakistan. It conceded the nuclear threat held by Pakistan, which is something the Indians really, really resent. And of course, then President Trump brought in the idea of trade with India into it, that Indians have to do a peace deal. Otherwise, I'll stop trade with you, or I'll only encourage trade with you thereafter. So in many ways, it has been a bad show from the United States if it comes to Mr. Modi and his government, and even otherwise other Indian observers like me. It is not something which is highly appreciated in India, and that's why, as I said earlier, it has put Mr. Modi in a particularly politically weak position, and he has been trying to wriggle his way out of it without naming the United States in his speeches and otherwise. As far as China is concerned, Eric, at this point in time, because of what has gone on in the last 4 years, or what has even gone on between India and China over the last 6 decades, it is highly unlikely that China can act as an honest broker or an honest arbitrator between India and Pakistan. Firstly, Indians refuse to accept that this is a unipolar Asia in which China is the dominant power, and we need to work under China. The fact that India went with the United States or formed the Quad was essentially to oppose the Chinese idea of a unipolar Asia. The Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar and other Indian officials have always opposed this idea that that China would control Asia, or China would control the region. This has been also an issue with South Asia, where India has tried to push Maldives, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and you've spoken about it. You've covered this so that China doesn't become the dominant player. So India would like to pitch itself as a peer to China. Of course, Chinese don't see India as a peer. Chinese want to pitch themselves against the United States. Pakistanis would like to pitch themselves against India. Indians don't want to see Pakistanis as their peer. So I think it's almost a kind of a cycle, or a kind of a ladder in which everybody is trying to pitch themselves to a superior adversary. So at this point in time, considering the kind of nationalist narrative that is there in India, the kind of history that is between India and China, and the way Indians see themselves, the way the Indian state sees itself, and the Indian people see themselves, it's highly unlikely that China can play a mediatory role or a superior role. China is seen as an adversarial power. China is seen as someone which is in collusion with Pakistan, which supports Pakistan, uses Pakistan to cause trouble to India. So that's why that remains a very far-fetched dream as of now.
Yeah, it's interesting that Modi now is coming under such criticism, because remember, he was supposed to have this very special relationship with Donald Trump, and if the special relationship isn't used at times like this, then what's the point? So I guess this sense of isolation that Modi must be feeling right now, and as you said, none of the kind of expected partners that would have turned out for India, or that maybe they would have expected to support India in this, did actually, and at least Pakistan had China firmly in its corner. Which may be seen by a number of people as an advantage for Pakistan. In terms of these peers, you point out, India's defense budget is 11 times larger than that of Pakistan's. China's defense budget is orders of magnitude larger than India's. So I guess them wanting to see each other as peers could be challenged by the numbers on that. One of the aftermaths that we've been seeing about this is, and we talked about this at the top of our conversation, is this kind of regression back to where we were in 2023. I'll just remind everybody that in 2020, there was something called the Galwan Valley incident, when 20 Indian soldiers were killed in a conflict with the Chinese. This was a series of confrontations that the Indians and Chinese had high in the Himalayas along India's eastern border, and where China calls its southern Tibet. And this kind of sent relations into a deep freeze. And as I mentioned, students, diplomats, direct air flights, trade kind of held up for the most part, but really there was just no contact between the two. And even going back to some of the diplomatic summits that Modi and Xi attended, they could barely look at each other at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in Samarkand, and then even at the BRICS summit in South Africa. Very tense relations. That changed last year. Things started to change, but now we're getting some hints that we're going back to the old days. Sushant, let me just talk to everybody about a new ban that went into effect on the social media platform X, where the Indian government has banned CGTN, Global Times, and Xinhua. Let's take a listen to the coverage from New Delhi television.
Global Times, the China mouthpiece, has now been blocked by the government, by the center. And this is for spreading fake news regarding India's defense services, India's army. Remember, China and Chinese representatives and such mouthpieces have been spreading a lot of misinformation regarding the conflict that took place between India and Pakistan. Let's go across to Vishal for more. And Vishal, this is a handle that had been pushing out a lot of disinformation, a lot of fake news, and now the center taking action against it. It has been blocked.
Well, that is absolutely correct. This has happened in the last 1 hour or so, that the account of Chinese mouthpiece Global Times was blocked on X, and this information, they have been spreading disinformation for a while now. They release big statements every now and then against India, and that is at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party. So this is essentially a mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party, and all day long, if you go to the X account of this website, you will see that it has all kinds of disinformation targeting India and rest of the world, and that is what India has taken action against. This is an action against disinformation, against fake propaganda that China has been caught doing for a while now, and Global Times was at the forefront of this disinformation campaign for a while. So India has acted against that and blocked this X account of Global Times. So it remains to be seen what China says now.
Okay, so it wasn't just Global Times, but also Xinhua and CGTN. Sushant, help us understand who is behind this. Again, you talked about how the military is speaking out on China, but the political side is not. How do we understand this ban on these X platforms these X channels from Chinese state media?
Yeah, so, Eric, these are not the only platforms. More than 8,000 handles were banned during this conflict, including from TRT, Turkish State Television, and many other places. So I think this seems to be part of a larger cohort of things. But clearly, I think some of them have been withdrawn. I'm not sure if Global Times has been withdrawn or not, but many of them were withdrawn, including TRT and others, because you can't ban, social media handles of state media platforms, especially if you have friendly diplomatic ties with those countries. That is just not done. And to even call Global Times a CCP mouthpiece, I think is a clear misunderstanding of what the CCP is or what the Global Times, what the Global Times is. And if you want to ban the social media handle, then why would you not? Why would you allow the website to be available freely in India? So it makes no sense. I think there was a lot of panic on the Indian side, and I think there was a lot of desire to demonstrate locally by various actors, whether in bureaucracy or ideologically committed actors or politically, to show that we are doing something is being done, we are taking action. I don't think there was a coherent political leadership directly controlling everything. We should not always. I've served in the government for 20 years while I was in the military. We should never think that the government works in a very coherent, cohesive manner. There are parts of the government which work on their own, and then people try and put everything together. So that's why there's been a lot of reversal of lot of these decisions and these policies, because there are parts of the government which start acting autonomously. People start behaving autonomously. They want to demonstrate that they are maybe more loyal than the king. They want to say, oh, we've acted against China, we've acted against Turkey, and that becomes embarrassing for the government, and the government has to then step back. So what it actually tells me is the government which was in disarray, which was in panic while the crisis was on, and was really not in control of what was going on. We should not try and read too much into it, other than the fact that a large number of Mr. Modi's supporters or his fellow ideological travelers see China as an adversary. And would want to target China in some manner or the other. There is a lack of trust against China in the ideological cohort to which Mr. Modi and Jaishankar belong, and I think that doesn't hold well for the future. That is how I would like to analyze it.
What do you make of the tone of the coverage that we've heard, which is, again, back to what it was in the pre-2024 era, which is China is to be seen as suspicious, China is hostile. We didn't see as much of that on these same media channels last year when things were improving, but it feels like those instincts have come back again. Am I overinterpreting that, or is there a tone change that's happened since the Pakistan conflict?
Yeah. Eric, these channels are absolute nonsense. You should stop watching them and following them.
But do they provide a zeitgeist at all? I mean, are they useful at all in terms of measuring, gauging public opinion?
No, they're not. They're not useful at all in terms of public opinion. They've gone pretty bonkers over the last few years. some of the coverage that of the India-Pakistan war, if you read The Economist or if you read the Financial Times or even the New York Times, some of these stuff that they had, these same channels which you're talking to had already captured Karachi. The Pakistani military chief had done a military coup. He had been arrested. This was officially being run on Thursday night on Indian television channels like the channel that you have. Even the channel which you referred to, the New Delhi Television, was bought by Mr. Adani, one of the India's top businessmen who's very close to Mr. Modi. It is no longer an independent platform to have any kind of credibility. A lot of these channels dish out nationalist rhetoric without any fact check, without any stuff, and they try and second guess what's going on and try and do that. Last year when you talk about the slightly friendlier tone towards China was essentially coming out because the government was clearly signaling that it would not want China to be portrayed as an adversary or as a target. But in a time of conflict with Pakistan, when the nationalist rhetoric was running very high, and these guys really didn't know what the political leadership was thinking, the political leadership seemed to be not having full control over the situation. These guys have gone on their own and tried to second guess that we should also hit out at China if we are hitting out at Turkey or at Azerbaijan, without realizing that India's political leadership is dealing with China very differently from how it is dealing with Pakistan or other countries. So I would guard you against overinterpreting it, but the fact remains, Eric, as you rightly said, that this does point to a kind of a narrative in India which can be easily tapped into if there is another crisis between India and China.
Well, I think a lot of our viewers and listeners are interested in following these stories. So if these media channels are not the place to go, where do you recommend? Where does someone like you, who takes this seriously and wants a more balanced coverage, go to get an Indian perspective on some of these issues that isn't as hyperbolic?
Yeah, so some of the some of the newspapers are pretty good. There is the Hindu newspaper, which is a newspaper of record. I would strongly recommend people should go to their website. They're a newspaper of record. They're a very serious, sober newspaper. The newspaper for which Anant Krishnan works, who has been
and we've had Anant on the show, and he's really one of the great China reporters of our time.
Absolutely, yeah, and so they are the most sober newspaper in English language media that they have. Then there are independent platforms like The Wire, Scroll, Caravan, News Minute, News Laundry. This is a very small group, but this is the only group I would recommend people to follow, particularly the Hindu and these independent platforms like The Wire, Scroll, Caravan, News Minute, News Laundry. These are the platforms in English language you can definitely follow and get a more sensible, more objective, more balanced reportage out of India. Television channels, Eric, I would strongly recommend both you and your viewers do not go near Indian television channels.
It's all correct. It's a little bit like in the U.S. We have a similar situation.
Neither I, Eric, nor my family members, nor my friends, nor my parents, nor my colleagues, nobody watches Indian television news.
But do the masses watch it?
No, masses.
It's not even popular.
Watch it that much. Some of the most popular, news broadcasts are essentially on YouTube, run by independent journalists in various regional languages, Hindi and other languages. They are the most popular. Those are the most popular things. These channels have completely discredited themselves. They run for very different reasons because, as I said, Mr. Adani has business interests. 70 of these platforms are owned by Mr. Ambani, Asia's richest man till some time back. So these are very different interests why these channels are being run. They have nothing to do with news or objective coverage or profit making. They are a different ballgame altogether, and that's why they've discredited themselves completely. And this has been reported extensively in global media and in RSF rankings as well.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen, again, I was just wondering if it was a situation like in the United States where Fox News, again, struggles with facts, but at the same time represents a very important constituency in the United States political universe. So these channels you're saying is not like that at all. Because they are a main source of a lot of the anti-China rhetoric that comes out of India. And for a lot of outsiders, we see these big TV channels with these big YouTube audiences and don't really fully understand where they fit in the ecosystem.
No, I completely agree with you, Eric. These channels do not represent a kind of a specific viewpoint. They have over a period of time become these very anarchic, very uncontrolled kind of beasts who do stuff which you really can't figure out or place. So they are not a version of Fox. They are not a version of any of that what we see in the United States. It's a pretty weird situation which is peculiar to South Asia, both in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. You see these in all these countries. These kind of networks which are completely devoid of any objectivity or they don't even apologize for broadcasting wrong news or shameful stuff.
No.
If you were saying you have captured Karachi port, which is the biggest port in Pakistan, at 12 at night, next day at least have the courage to come out and say an apology. None of them have apologized. They have actually justified it, saying this is part of information warfare and therefore we were doing it. Can you imagine news television channels saying that?
Crazy.
That's the level we are at now.
Very quickly before we go, I want to get your take on this topic that we mentioned at the beginning of the show very briefly, but China renamed 27 locales along its disputed border. Many of those are in Indian territory. The Indian government responded by calling it preposterous and discounted it. Of course, this is not the first time that they've done this. I think it's about the fifth time that they've done it. But the Indian side claims that it is part of China's campaign to undermine Indian sovereignty of this area. What is surprising to me is that the timing of them to do this. Now, again, as you pointed out with the Indian government, the left hand and the right hand are not always in sync with one another. That is the same with the Chinese government as well. Any organization that is as large as these governments are don't always operate in sync. However, the timing seems to be particularly sensitive now for the Chinese Foreign Ministry to announce these name changes. What do you think on the Chinese side motivated them to do this now? Maybe India was distracted and this would be a time to do it. And tell us a little bit about the Indian reaction to these name changes.
So, Eric, there is a whole history to it. Every time India and Pakistan have a military conflict, whether in 65 or 71 or 99, Chinese have always tried to put some kind of pressure on India or signal some kind of support to Pakistan. And I think by announcing this when the military conflict was on between India and Pakistan, this was a way of telling India that where did the Chinese stay, and that there was a border crisis that still stayed, and there was a complex border issue between India and China, and parts of the Chinese government, as you say, of the Chinese Foreign Ministry or within the party, were trying to signal both to Pakistan and to India that don't forget that we exist and we have a problem and there are soldiers on both sides deployed here. That was very clearly the intention. The Indians were definitely livid about it. As you said, the Indians responded very strongly to it, saying, this is completely unacceptable and you've done it earlier. Why are you doing it now? So, Eric, where the problem comes here essentially is there's a principle of settled areas between India and China. When India and China were having border talks till around 10 years back, one of the principles that was accepted was that settled areas will not be disturbed. Now, these are settled areas where Indian administration is there, elections happen, everything happens. And to question these areas, these settled areas, really rankles India. India says, everything that we have agreed upon, has been thrown to the wolves in a certain sense. So that is where the response, the aggressive response, or the kind of very disappointed kind of a response from India is coming. I think if I can quickly come in, I know we're running short of time. There's also been a problem with the Indian Commerce Minister and the trade thing, because he tried to blame China's entry to WTO for whatever has gone on since, and not blame Trump. KG Mao, the Chinese scholar who's at Harvard now, wrote about it very strongly, saying that Indians are playing a dirty game if they think that they can take advantage of the China-US trade war. And I think all that has added up in a certain sense to what you were hinting at earlier, that the relationship between India and China, the improvement has either stalled, if not gone back since last year.
And let's not forget that the Chinese have restricted exports of germanium, which is a critical resource that used for high-tech manufacturing. There have also been reports by Rest of World that they're restricting the flow of skilled personnel to come to India to help set up manufacturing. I guess the idea is that if the Indians are going to start taking some of the Chinese manufacturing, the Chinese don't want to help them. And so this trade relationship that for so long has seemed immune from some of the political problems that have afflicted the relationship is now getting sucked in part because the United States is trying to divert more manufacturing to India and out of China. That being said, let's not forget Donald Trump is not happy at all that Apple is setting up its factories in India that it used to have in China. So India, again, caught in the middle between the U.S. and China. How does it navigate between these two superpowers who are trying to battle it out on trade? What direction does Modi take it in terms of both the U.S. and China?
Oh, it's a very tough call to take, but I think Indians should not be taking one side. if they thought that they could benefit between the trade war between the United States and China. President Trump has gone back on the tariff war, and the Chinese and China and America already have a big deal. So all the advantages that Indians were thinking that they would get out of this have already gone out of the window in a certain sense. And President Trump is hell bent upon embarrassing India in a certain sense. He's not given any concessions. He goes out and publicly says stuff which is politically very damaging for Mr. Modi and very embarrassing for the government, that Indian government has agreed to zero tariffs. The Chinese, on the other hand, are quite silent about it. They don't say anything. The trade between India and China continues to increase, of course, dominated by China. But as you rightly said, Chinese are also putting roadblocks into any kind of major manufacturing, particularly the iPhone going into India. So whether it is the iPhone assembly machinery or the subsystems plants, the Chinese are not allowing them to really come to India. India will have to, as you rightly said, play it very, very carefully because they seem to be stuck between a rock and a hard place in this.
Yeah. It strikes me that, again, this is why I'm surprised by what the Chinese are doing on this side, because given the tensions that they're having with the Americans, the Indians and India more largely presents a huge potential market for Chinese products, for Chinese vehicles. And if the détente was allowed to pursue and continue as we saw for the past year, and there was a softening of ties, again, why the Chinese are lining up with Pakistan when you see that the future possibilities with India are potentially much larger for Chinese geopolitical interests, particularly if the Chinese can pull India away from the Quad a little bit, just put a little bit of daylight in between those two. That could fracture a very important security relationship that the United States has in Asia Pacific. So I'm just surprised by the way the Chinese are playing this right now, because long-term Pakistan doesn't have as much to offer China in terms of dividends than India does if the relationship was able to get on the right track.
No, that's a big if. If the relationship was able to get on the right track, I think there's a distinct lack of trust between India and China, and that is there for historical reasons. The Communist Party versus a democracy versus what the ties with the United States, etc., etc., etc. And I think that's the big roadblock. Also, India is of a big size. India is the same population as China, and therefore there is a lot of reluctance to actually build India up into a big power, because that would be a direct competitor to China. Also, the fact is that the Indian market, in certain sense, is exaggerated, because the consuming Indian market, which can buy the kind of stuff that you are referring to, is only 200 million. It's not 1.4 billion. It's a very unequal country and a very poor country. Arik, as I remind people, India is only a $2,600 per capita country. China is now nearly $13,000. US is $86,000, and it's a very unequal country. So the market is really not that big in that sense. But geostrategically, yes, the Chinese have been trying very hard that Indians should not completely go and become a US ally or be a part of the Quad. And I think Indians have taken that offer from China and not really allowed securitization of Quad, or not really done anything which would provoke China or allow blocks to be created. India would want to be friends with both China and the United States, but the kind of thing that you talk about, where India and China are friends to the extent that Pakistan is completely marginalized, or the Chinese choose India over Pakistan, would be unlikely. There's one more reason here, Eric. When the crisis began since in 2020 over on the border, a lot of Chinese companies in India were targeted by tax authorities, by police, by regulatory agencies, and that really hurt the relationship, because then the big worry for Chinese investors, Chinese manufacturers, is if tomorrow something happens in some godforsaken place in the Himalayas, the Indian government is going to come after us in a big way. So there's a lot of reluctance to really go all out and invest in a big manner with having seen what has gone on in the last 4 years. So all these factors come together and create an environment of distrust, and that's not easy to overcome.
And that was very personal, because they literally went after senior Chinese executives, and there was real concern that Chinese nationals who were running these companies, managers, were potentially in danger of being arrested. And so it made for a lot of resistance for Chinese companies to invest or put people into India, and that still isn't there. So I guess you're not very optimistic on the future, or at least the near-term future of the India-China relationship repairing, at least. What are you thinking in terms of the next 6 months, given what we've been seeing in Pakistan and where we are today in the China-Pakistan relationship? What do you think we should expect? How would you tell our viewers and listeners to kind of think about this issue right now?
So I think at a strategic level, India would want peace with China. India, I think the Indian political leadership, the Indian diplomatic leadership will go out of its way to ensure that there is no flare-up with China, that China is not provoked in any way. At least the status quo of where the relationship with China is, with no military conflagration, with no diplomatic provocation, at least that continues. Because if India has to focus its attention on Pakistan, then it can't afford to provoke China at all. So the political leadership, the diplomatic leadership will be pretty clear. What we will see is from this nationalist media and sections of the military or people who speak for the military trying to show that there is a collusive threat that is coming from China along with Pakistan. And that threat is really something we need to counter. And for that, we need more budgets, more resources. And so I think we will see these two tracks. But we should clearly, as you said at the beginning, look very clearly what Modi is saying and what rest of the media, unofficial stuff that is coming out. I would very closely watch Mr. Modi, Mr. Jaishankar. If they go out and start hitting at China and saying China is propping up Pakistan or China is building Pakistan, then I would be really, really worried. Then that's something else. I don't see that happening. I see a kind of a status quo, a kind of a political friendliness between India and China while India tries to target Pakistan.
That is some great advice. Again, we all have to become smarter media consumers, especially in a place like India, where it is not easy to figure out what's going on. And so your insights are very much appreciated. Sushant Singh, thank you so much for your time today. Sushant is a lecturer in South Asian Studies at Yale University and joins us today from New Delhi to help us explain everything that's going on in the complex India-Pakistan-China dynamic. Thank you so much, Sushant, for your time.
Thank you, Eric. It was wonderful and always enjoyable to talk to you.
Likewise, and I'll be back again next week with Kovas for another edition of the China Global South podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening and for watching.